This is just letting you know that we're going to be starting the webinar in about one more minute. Thank you for your patience. All right. Well, welcome to the Wilson Library Research Forum. I guess I'll begin with my traditional bemoaning of how fast time goes. I actually cannot believe that it's April 9th. Welcome today. We're going to have two of our former fellows speak with us. The format's going to be roughly the same as it's been in the past. We'll give each presenter a half hour to say their piece. And then at the end, we'll come together and we'll ask questions of both of them. So we're looking at something that's going to be going a little bit more than an hour and 10, an hour and 15 minutes. So our first presenter today is Kaitlyn Clingenpeel. And Kaitlyn worked with us last summer, and she was the recipient of a rare book collection, Haynes Graduate Fellowship. She is currently a fifth-year PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology here on campus. She received her BA in Sociology from Winthrop University in the spring of 2020 and her master's in Anthropology in the summer of 2023 from Chapel Hill for her research using ceramic data to identify networks of interaction for the site of Kashaobi. And I actually practiced that and still blew it, in Belize. Her research focuses on taking ceramic data from sites around the Mayan region to create networks via social network analysis to attempt to identify communities of shared ceramic practice in both northern Belize and the rest of the region. Kaitlyn is also serving as the program director for Inherit, an Indigenous heritage passed on to the present, an organization centered on celebrating Indigenous heritage through collaborations that help to educate, conserve, and advocate for Native languages, traditions, and rights to the past. Well, thank you, Kaitlyn. I'm going to get out of your way, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to tell us today about your research and what you've been doing with the data subsequently.
Great, thank you so much. My screen shared. Okay, can we see that? Okay. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here today and talk about a little bit about my work, about who I am, my time at the Wilson Library, and share some of the results that I have gotten from completing this fellowship. My dissertation is titled Slipped and Scored Network Analysis of Changing Communities of Shared Ceramic Practice at Cashel, Belize. This is a collections-based project using ceramic data from around the Maya region. And if you it's blurry, but if you can kind of see the shelves of boxes, this is the Kushov collection that's housed here at UNC. Um, I'm taking ceramic data from sites across the region to map similar ceramic attributes and characteristics into social networks that demonstrate possible modes of interaction and sharing ideas among the Maya people and to hopefully show Kushov's involvement in those potting traditions. So to give you a rundown of what I'm going to talk about, I am going to briefly talk a little bit more about who I am and how I got here and my time in the Wilson Library last summer for my fellowship, and then give a quick little background rundown of some things that you need to know to help understand the data, and then go through the steps that I've taken since the project and show some preliminary results. So first and foremost, I'm a Maya archaeologist and a ceramicist, and I actually have a background in pottery. That is what drew me to looking at ceramics. Um, and so I really love the perspective that that's given me. I'm really interested in social network analysis and communities of practice and interaction. And all of those things have kind of helped form this project. And my sort of like other passions are community engagement, cultural heritage, and education that also helped me in my position as program director for Inherit. Um, I've done a lot of research in a lot of different places around Mesoamerica. I have conducted projects looking at the relationship between indigenous language use and socioeconomic status and education in Mexico, and then the history of interaction between archaeologists and Maya descendant communities in Guatemala. So what drew me to pursuing a rare book fellowship at the Wilson Library was the fact that I've had many other graduate students in the anthropology department that have received this fellowship and done work in the collections. And I thought, I'll just look around, see if there's anything that could be useful for me. And in the process of looking around, I came across the Stewart collection. The Georgie Stewart collection of archaeological and other materials is one of the rare book collections housed in the Special Collections Library, and it has a particular interest with the Maya region. George Stewart was a Maya archaeologist, and he actually got his PhD in anthropology from UNC in 1975, which is why we have this collection. He donated some of his library in 2006. He also served as worked at National Geographic Society from 1960 to 1998, and has another set up at the Boundary End Research Center in Barnardsville, North Carolina, that also has a great library containing materials relating to Maya and Southeastern US archaeology. And collections like this are really important for the work that I am trying to do. The collections are ceramic data. The reports that are published on it are usually very limited runs. Not too many people, it's a very niche topic, not too many people are interested in it. Or like the people that are interested in it, it's a small pool of people. So it's really hard to get your hands on those unless you were there when they were published, and those date back into the late 50s, early 60s usually. So a collection like this that has such a long-standing breadth of time that these books and reports were acquired from is really helpful. And it certainly has made work a lot easier for this project. So to just sort of give some introduction and background, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Maya region to situate us geographically and temporally, and then talk about what ceramic analysis is and social networks and how they relate into my work. So the Maya region consists of the easternmost piece of Mexico with like the Yucatan Peninsula and down into the highlands in Chiapas, Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, and then the westernmost portion of Honduras. And the time period that I'm focusing on the right, you see you've got the years and then the major periods broken down. So from about 1200 BC up to 1200 CE, before the Common Era and into the Common Era. I also want to point out this particular image uses the term formative. I end up using the term pre-classic a lot. Mean the same thing. And instead of proto-classic, I use terminal classic. It's all the same thing. The time periods that those major periods took place in are the same. And so I'm particularly interested in the transition from the late pre-classic into the early classic period. So the period from 400 BCE to 550 AD. So ceramic analysis in the Maya area is typically utilizes a type variety method of classification, which when I try to explain this, I use the example of the biological animal taxonomy. So you've got the most broad similarities and you kind of get narrower and narrower until you're down to one particular species. And then you have that name that is the genus and the species combined. Sort of the same thing. You have very broad ceramic systems that then get narrowed down a little bit into spheres and then wares, groups, and then you get the type and variety. And those two are the key pieces that I use for my work. So these ceramic classifications are made based on similar attributes, and the attributes we look at include the paste, which is the type of clay that's used to make the pot, the temper, which is any materials that are added to the clay to change the clay and make it stronger or things like that. The surface finish, it refers to any decoration that's added to the vessel. There's slip colors, so the color that you see painted on the outside of and the inside of a vessel, any like incising or impressions, designs that are included on it all fall into the surface finish category. And then the form or the construction of the vessel that gives us an idea of what the shape of it was. And from that shape, we can infer what its function was based on shape and then also the context that vessels are found within. For ceramic or social network analysis, this is a visual representation of the ties between people and their interactions. These ties are represented by the lines connecting these dots. These lines are links, and these dots are nodes. The nodes often represent the people, and the lines represent some kind of thing that ties them together. In my case, for my project, social network analysis is really great because it's really flexible and you can look at things at different scales. You can compare them across time. And so for me, all of these dots that you're going to see, the nodes, they are representing the sites around the region, and then the links that are connecting them are based on shared ceramic types. In this case, in this image here that I'm using as an example, the proximity of the nodes represents the strength. So the closer they are together, the stronger the connection between those nodes is, and the farther apart, the weaker it is. For me, I had an interest in making sure that things were geographically aligned. So my nodes are fixed in a approximate geographic location. So it's sort of similar. Sites that are close to each other are close to each other. That's not necessarily reflective of how strong their tie is. So instead, these links that are connecting them are thinner and lighter, and then they get thicker and darker the stronger that the tie is. So with that in mind, I'm going to take a moment to walk you through my dissertation project and then show those preliminary results that I have been able to gather so far. I chose the title Slipped and Scored. I'm a big fan of having a title that's not just, here is exactly what I'm doing. I want something sort of fun to it. And for people that have made pottery before, slipping and scoring is the method of joining clay together. You incise little lines into the two pieces of clay you want to bring together. And then you take slip, which this is a different kind of slip than the stuff that is painted on the outside of a pot. This slip is really watered down clay that you use as like a glue. So you score the pot and the piece you're trying to attach, put slip on both sides, squish them together, and it fuses it together when it's fired. I also think that while slipping and scoring refers to the joining of clay, I'm also talking about clay as a joining factor for people. For pottery specifically, the methods are things that are taught to you by someone. The technologies you use are handed down, and the final pieces and the pottery that we find in the ground is a physical representation of the hands that made it and all of the generations prior that have taught and passed down the information. So with that in mind, taking a look at Kasho, Kasho is a site located in the swampy wetlands of northern Belize. If you look at this little pop out, they're right there. And so this map of the Maya region with some of the sites, not all of these sites are the ones that I use in my project, but this is just a good map giving you an idea of what's around. And then you can see the site map on the right with the different plazas and the layout and the wetlands to the west. The Kashob Archaeological Project was conducted across many years from 1990 to 1998. So, and is mainly known for its large pre-classic settlement period. But this collection has been out of the ground for a long time, and it was really important to me to help bring some of this data out and get it out into the world and not just sitting on shelves. For Kashob's chronology, this is the same image I showed you earlier with the major periods of the Maya region, adding in another column called a ceramic complex. All of the ceramics from a particular time period at a particular site are grouped together to form a complex. So these complexes are typically named. In this case, we've got some pretty interesting names. So the middle formative is the Chakash complex. The late pre-classic and terminal classic is combined into the Katapchekash, early classic Nohokash, late and terminal classic Wheatskash, and then the early and late post-classic Kimilkash. So for my master's thesis, I also worked with Kashob's ceramic data and a few other sites around the region to do a smaller version of what I'm doing now. And I focused on the transition from the late and terminal classic into the post-classic. This was a very disruptive time and is often called like the Maya collapse. That's what a lot of people know it as. It wasn't actually a collapse. It was just there was disruption and then reorganization into something new. And so for this project, I'm focusing on the transition from the late formative period into the early classic. And then as I've collected my data and finished data collection and looking at all of the sites that I have, I ended up extending it to include the middle formative period, just to get a full scope of Kashob's occupation. So the interest in these periods comes from the fact that they're a little harder to nail down. The Maya really loved to build on top of existing architecture. So a lot of the pre-classic and early classic is buried beneath late classic and post-classic structures. So it makes it a little harder to see what's going on there. And the transition from the late formative into the early classic has a similar disruptive event like as to the late and terminal classic periods. In the late pre-classic, which is sort of this like center time, you see the appearance of monumental architecture and evidence that they were fostering community and indications of a possible increase in religious and economic activities. But they were also putting a lot of strain on the environment due to unsustainable use of resources. So this is probably a factor that definitely played into the disruptive transition into the early classic. So for my project, I have 34 sites that I've collected ceramic data from across the region that I make these very large, wide um, spread networks for. And then I've also taken a smaller subset of those sites in northern Belize, these 8 sites that are really close together, and we already have evidence that they were interacting to see what we can learn about them as this sort of small neighborhood, how their interactions changed over time, and then looking broader at the wider scope. So you saw that chronology table, and I have spent some time, I've made a massive one of all 34 sites so that you can see their timelines spread out. It's really small. That's the only way that I can get it all on one slide. But know that like each of these boxes is a ceramic complex, and then you've got the major periods on this side. So spanning the middle classic to early classic, these are all of the complexes that are encompassed in this project. And taking those and shifting, taking all of that ceramic data, I formed like a big database where I have these tables that cover a particular site, the ceramic complexes and their associated time periods, and then lists of all of the types, some of them with their varieties. And then each of these complexes then has a separate table that gets into a little more detail with the ceramic group, type, variety, and then frequency where available. And my intention is to take that frequency data and then run these analyses again with a subset where I only have the frequencies and see what I can learn from making these comparisons based on how many and not just the presence and absence. So for now, though, I have results for presence and absence. All of those tables and spreadsheets were put into one really long list where on the left side here, you have every single type from all 34 sites. So these are very, very long. They're at least like 4 or 5 pages each when you squish it so all the columns are on the same page. And then you have every site across the top and X's indicating the presence of a particular type at any of the sites. So this table for each of the time periods was run through Python, paired with the approximate geographic positions of all of the sites. And this produced and put into a program that will plot a network map. And that gives you something that looks like this. So this is for all of the middle pre-classic sites. You have all of your nodes and their sites that they're associated with. For the nodes, the darker it is, the less connected it is. So these ones that are almost white or really light have the most connections across the board. And then you can see here how there's thinner, more transparent lines versus thicker, darker lines that represent stronger connections between sites. So we can look at this and see there's a pretty decent amount of connection happening in these sites, which are some of those northern Belizean sites. And then good connections heading into the southern Lowlands. But looking at this alone, it can tell you something, but we want to see the change over time. So from the middle pre-classic into the late and terminal classic, a lot more is going on. Very strong connections regionally. So these northern Belizean sites and in the southern Lowlands, the northern lowlands, so up in the north of the Yucatan, is starting to also get a little more involved. And then going into the early classic, there's sort of the same amount of connection, but it's shifted. So where you have really strong, just like with intra-regional ties, it gets a little more inter-regional into the early classic. And you get a really sort of strong presence in the southern Lowlands, and Belize kind of spreads out. This is a lot, and I know it's a lot. I'm still kind of trying to figure out everything that's going on here. which is why I wanted to include the smaller subset of 8 sites. It's a lot more digestible. So in the middle pre-classic, looking at those the ceramics from those 8 sites, there's this one really strong connection between the site of Kohat and Nohmul, and then Kashob, Cuello, and Aventura also have some pretty strong connections. And when you shift into the late and terminal pre-classic, that strong Nahmul Kohat connection stays, and Cuello and Kashob also join that stronger force, but everybody's getting involved. And there's a pretty good spread. But when you shift into the early classic, their strong ties fall off. And so things are a little thinner, and this is likely representative of, in the other early classic map, it aligns with the fact that the strong intra-regional ties sort of fell off and opted into a more inter-regional approach. And that aligns with moving into the late classic when all of the kingdoms in the southern lowlands start to appear. So this is the data I have so far. I am working to interpret this and get more analysis completed, which takes me into sort of the next steps of where I'm going. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to the Society for American Archaeologists annual meeting in Denver, where I'll be presenting on my dissertation work and my preliminary findings. For the rest of the semester after that and into the summer, I'll be trying to complete all of my data analysis and then shift into hopefully dissertation writing full time in the fall. And like this would not have been possible without this opportunity. I spent a lot of time like pouring through all of those books. And it definitely has helped speed up my progress to have had this opportunity. So I'm really grateful for that. So thank you, everyone. This would not have been possible without this Haynes Graduate Fellowship and everyone who works at the Wilson Library. And I'm also grateful for the support of my advisor, Dr. Patricia McEnany, and all of my committee members, Ben Arbuckle, John Marcoux, Ben Stephanitis, and David Morat-Marine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kaitlyn. This may have been our first presentation like this. That is really fascinating. It's such one of the things that's really hard for us is to imagine non-traditional use of the collections. And it's really helpful to have you walk us through your process and some of your outputs. I look forward to our questions. Great. So now we're going to move on to our second fellow. So this is Olivia Phillips, and Olivia was here as part of the Southern Studies doctoral fellowship, and that was funded by the Parker Dooley Fund. Olivia is a traditional singer and a PhD candidate in folklore at Indiana University, where she's also earned a master's degree in ethnomusicology. Her dissertation research emphasizes traditional singing and song in her native Beech Mountain community of North Carolina as spaces for shaping narratives about local identity, heritage, and ethnic origins. Her broader research interests include Appalachia, Ireland, Scotland, African American influences in Southern Appalachian musical styles and singing techniques. In addition to being a 2024 Southern Studies doctoral fellow, Olivia has taught in IU's Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology, College of Arts and Sciences, and has worked for Traditional Arts Indiana, the North Carolina Arts Council's Folklife Program, and Music Maker Foundation. She holds a bachelor's of vocal music from East Tennessee State. Thank you for visiting us today, Olivia. Look forward to hearing from you.
Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for having me. It's really an honor to have the support of the University of North Carolina's Wilson Special Collections Library as a Southern Studies doctoral fellow, and it's been a pleasure to spend time with just a fraction of the incredible archives that you have there. The research that I undertook in 2024 in July as a Southern Studies doctoral fellow informs my imminent dissertation fieldwork, which it will examine the past and present role of traditional singing in North Carolina's Beech Mountain community, a place that's long drawn the interest of folklorists from beyond the region in shaping local heritage narratives or the stories that people tell themselves or others about who they are, who their families have been, and where they come from. Employing ethnographic interviews, observations, and oral histories alongside analyses of relevant archival collections, I'll consider the ways that folklorists and residents have understood and influenced each other's perceptions of local ethnic identity in relation to music and folk life from the 1910s to the present. And the study encompasses both secular and religious song traditions and is informed by my knowledge of Beech Mountain as not only a folklorist, but a community native. And I'll show you just a quick map here. Here we are in the northwestern corner of North Carolina. Most of what you see here is Watauga County, and then Avery to the south here. I realized very conveniently while looking at this map that I can pretty easily show you kind of the extent of where my research concentrates. Can be divided here on US Highway 421, down along 194 and 19E to the Tennessee line, with this kind of wonky little oval being the area that I'm mainly focusing on. So I accessed many inspiring resources at the Wilson Special Collections Library in July 2024 to help further my dissertation research. The focus of today's presentation is narrowed to 3 collections whose contents were created mainly between the 1910s and the 1930s, but as late as the early 1960s. And that includes the Maud Minish Sutton papers, the Annabelle Morris Buchanan papers, and the Arthur Palmer Hudson collection. I'm going to start by contextualizing these collections within some of the larger trends of folklore collecting in Appalachia. But in considering these materials, I explore 2 primary angles, and those are what those archives tell us about the lenses of their collectors, and then what they tell us about the songs and the singers being documented. And the presentation will be loosely divided between those 2 sort of perspectives, which of course are not always so easily dichotomized. I'll overview findings from the Sutton papers, the Buchanan papers, and Hudson collection chronologically for insight on the motivations of the creators before probing them for clues about the lives, worldviews, singing, and songs of singers in northern Avery and western Watauga counties during the early to mid 20th century. As I mentioned, I'll discuss how my findings fit into broader themes of folklore collecting in southern Appalachia during the first half of the 20th century, highlight where collectors were influenced by desire to identify these old world, what they might call retentions, and then consider what repertoire and field notes reveal about Avery and Watauga County singers of the era, and wherever possible, emphasize vocal conventions for the singers of, and what those conventions may be able to tell us about the singers' enculturation. Historian John Alexander Williams writes that Appalachia, quote, is more than most of the regions into which the United States is customarily divided, a territory of images, a screen upon which writers, artists, and savants for several generations have projected their fears, hopes, regrets, and enthusiasm about America past and present, end quote. Having been perceived during the late 19th and early 20th centuries as a repository for endangered traditions and a cradle of Anglo-American culture, the regions played a notable role in American folklore history. The collections I discuss today are part of that broader history of folk song and ballad collecting in southern and central Appalachia, and they're vulnerable to a common critique. Like other collectors of the day, Sutton, Buchanan, and Hudson sought select materials in their field ventures, especially those associated with the edited volumes of Cecil Sharp, Francis J. Child, and the English and Scottish diaspora. To some degree, it's inevitable that the values and ideals of collectors influence that which they choose to collect and that which they leave unpublished or leave behind altogether. Pre-existing expectations for findings impacted what was sought by collectors and how it was received. often excluded intentionally or otherwise were religious songs and those of African American origin. Other exclusions were songs that some collectors deemed as crude, unartistic, or derived from commercial recordings. Repertoire included and excluded by those collectors continues to shape expectations of what should and should not be considered Appalachian traditional music today. The history of political motivated song collecting in Appalachia makes examining motivations of collectors essential to understanding their collections. And while in residence at the Wilson Library by day and studying for my qualifying exams at night, I was inspired by Irish music scholar Deirdre Nachangala, and her book Collecting Music in the Aran Islands, which drove home this message that sort of sat with me since then. Like myself, Nihangala researches her home community and examines collections and collectors from a range of periods to consider how their motivations impacted the documentation of local traditions. And so I draw inspiration from her work. But onto the collections. I'll begin by discussing the papers of Maud Minish Sutton, a song collector, teacher, and journalist from Lenoir, North Carolina, which, if you know anything about this region of the state, Caldwell County is to the just to the southeast of Watauga, but whereas you would have kind of a mountainous area along the escarpments of Grandfather Mountain, where Watauga, Caldwell, and Avery meet. Most of Caldwell would be in the foothills. So this is where Sutton is from. She collected ballads and folk songs extensively in Avery and Caldwell counties, beginning in the late 1910s. And later in this presentation, we'll consider the singers and the songs. But for now, we'll get to know Sutton, her work, and what the work tells us about her research methods and motivations. In the Sutton papers, I examined 3 folders containing an original short story, a collection of children's folk games from Western North Carolina, and field notes and lyrical transcriptions for 45 ballads collected in Avery County between 1917 and 1918. Some of what I discovered about Sutton also came from the Daniel W. Patterson collection, as Patterson conducted research extensively on Sutton's work and legacy. And I've since learned that more of Sutton's writings are located elsewhere in the Wilson, and I look forward to visiting again to access them soon. Like many collectors of her day, Sutton demonstrated an interest in connecting Western North Carolina ballads and their singers to England, Scotland, and occasionally Ireland. Citations and references in her compilation of children's games included not only William Wells Newell's Games of American Children, but also Lady Alice Gaume's traditional Games of England, Scotland, and Ireland, her Dictionary of British Folklore, an unnamed, quote, old book on British folklore, and of course, Child's English and Scottish popular ballads. As can be seen from this current slide, she frequently commented on her certainty that the songs she heard must be of English or Scottish origin. And of the 45 songs in the field notes I accessed, Sutton identified 7 as child ballads, 6 as Scottish, 4 as English, and 1 as Irish, but referred to many others as ancient or related to distant ancestors. The folders I accessed contain only 4 Beech Mountain ballads collected from a Miss Brown on Flat Springs Road and a Miss Farthing in Beech Creek. Sutton seems to take special interest in the area's, quote, ancient ties and Old World retentions. And she writes in her children's game collection that, quote, the children of Beech Mountain School, whom I saw playing Sally Walker in the form most like Mrs. Gaume's earliest variants, came from homes very like those of our pioneer ancestors and had been rocked to sleep with folk songs of Old England, could themselves sing Barbara Allen, the Brown Girl, Lady Isabel and the Elf Knight, and the Cherry Tree Carol, which is known to have been sung as early as the 13th century, end quote. Early in her ballad collecting field notes, Sutton remarked that, quote, Lord Lovell must be a very ancient song ballad. I heard it way down in a cave on the beach. These uses of traditional song to connect Beech Mountain people to the old world and to the ancestors of their contemporaries are two of many similar examples in Sutton's writing. In her early days of collecting, Sutton evaluated the people she met by her own aesthetic sensibilities, social and class expectations, rather than those of the singers themselves. She employed I dialect heavily in her field notes and expressed disbelief in the superstitions of those she met there. She often discussed her fervent disagreement with local political leanings. Song content and Sutton's evaluation of their structural and performance quality both shaped and reflected her views of the mountain people that she met. She wrote that popular folk song Sourwood Mountain, for instance, was one whose, quote, obvious crudity and, quote, simplicity meant it could only be sung and played by someone drunk on white lightning. Sometimes Sutton also equated song choice with local morals and values, assuming, for instance, that infidelity, violence, and misogyny represented in Oh Me Wise reflected morality in the Plumtree community where she heard it along the Tow River in southern Erie County. Reflecting another common theme for folklorists of her era, many of whom romanticized the folk while also regarding them as quote unquote primitive. Sutton seems to have been caught somewhere between disdain and admiration for the traditions and lifestyles of those with whom she interacted in Avery County. One journal entry reads, quote, "How I hate to see the moving picture take the place of this real literature. Those lonesome tunes, their crudities are as much a part of the folk to whom they belong as the rhododendrons are a part of the mountainside." Her reverence toward locals contrasted with her appreciation for all that could be connected to the old world. Writing on variants of the Texas Ranger in Avery County, Sutton commented that the song was, quote, "worthless? Yes, in a way they are, but they have possibilities. I've never seen Catherine Jeffries in print, but I'm sure Sir Walter Scott had heard it, and I believe Tennyson must have been familiar with The Brown Girl," end quote. She compared Avery County ballads to great world literary and artistic traditions such as Greek tragedies and myths. It's only fair, though, to share that Patterson's 1977 Southern Exposure article on Sutton praises her personal growth beyond these early ethnocentric tendencies. I believe Patterson draws from Sutton's later journals and newspaper articles that I've yet to access fully. However, examples of Sutton's growth are still evident in the field notes that I read. She once wrote of an herbal cure she took from a local woman, quote, "I expected it to kill me, but instead it cured the ulcer," end quote. She passionately opposed a New Hampshire man who compared Avery County mountain music to the relationship a, quote, "child's drawing bears to a finished picture." As I read more of Sutton's writings, I also determined that many of her comments appear to be tongue-in-cheek, and she seems to critique, for instance, the laziness of a man called Uncle Si, but it soon becomes apparent that she regards him with great affection. Next, I looked at the Annabelle Morris Buchanan papers. Buchanan was a folklorist, composer, and festival organizer who traveled to Boone, Cove Creek, and Beech Creek in Watauga County on a collecting venture in 1936. I accessed song transcriptions from this trip, a few typewritten letters from Beech Mountain's R.M. Ward, and an unpublished manuscript titled White Top Mountain Trails, or White Top Music Trails, in the Buchanan papers. Many scholars of Appalachian studies, Southern studies, and folklore might recognize Annabelle Morris Buchanan's name from her involvement with Southwest Virginia's White Top Folk Festival during the 1930s, detailed in David Wisnant's classic 1983 monograph, All That Is Native and Fine. Wisnant's view of Buchanan and the festival is largely unforgiving, presenting the event's devotion to Anglo-American heritage as a celebration of whiteness and a desire for racial purity. The foreword to Buchanan's manuscript helps capture her motivations as a collector and public programmer to celebrate and validate some of white America's oldest folk life by tying it to England. She writes that, quote, "the songs belong to America as surely as we ourselves belong to America. Our roots are deep in Old World soul, and so, then, must be our music, our balladry, our traditions. But of what use is this heritage unless known and utilized and thereby possessed? End quote. She continues on. Quote, for there awaiting you in this is the open sesame of a new and delightful country where laying aside the cares of every day, one may wander leisurely along old folkways with friends both old and new. Would you catch the whisper of secret druidical rites from some magical oaken grove of ancient Britain to hear it echoed 2,000 years later from a Virginia mountain top? Would you perchance marvel with Mary and Joseph at the bowing down of the cherry tree on the way to Bedlam, and marvel again at the same story in the dim lamplight of a Tennessee mountain cabin? Would you journey along the road to Canterbury, thrilling to the tale of the prioress, and hear another form of the same legend centuries later from the walls of the White House? End quote. And finally, she had a lot to say on this. Buchanan writes that, quote, all these English-speaking people assembled. Why? We have come now to the real story, for the folk trails leading from the mountain festival into every corner of America lead also back into the old world, further and further, until Appalachian mists have merged with the far horizon of ancient Britain, awaiting the dawn of history. In Beech Creek, Buchanan collected a handful of songs from four singers, who we'll talk about a bit more later. Those are Miss Emmy Harmon, R.M. Ward, Mr. H.E. Hageman, and Callie Ward. R.M. exchanged letters with Buchanan. He performed at White Top. He sent her song texts and pleasantries. Little from these singers or Watauga County was included in Buchanan's manuscript, but she inevitably viewed them through the lens that she revealed in the White Top Music Trails. In addition to her conviction that Southern Appalachian songs were valuable primarily for their Old World retentions, Buchanan's reception of this music was also colored by her belief in the superiority of art music and her assumption that many of the people who she distinguished to be, that she labeled them white trash as opposed to like the true mountaineer. She said that she didn't believe these people were capable of remembering and valuing and performing truly music that was truly deserving of the label art. And lastly, the Arthur Palmer Hudson collection. I most certainly did not spend the entire summer calling him Arnold Palmer Hudson. That wasn't me. Hudson was a Mississippian by birth, but he was a song collector and editor for the Frank C. Brown collection of North Carolina folklore. There's much to be gleaned from the Wilson Library's Hudson collection, but some of the materials that I found most interesting were discards, those song transcriptions that the Brown collection's editors chose not to publish. Materials were discarded for being copyrighted, commercial, or too, quote, sentimental, quote, moralizing, or, quote, untraced. Some were rejected because of deep associations with other states and countries that seemed to conflict with their possible North Carolinian natures. Less discernible reasons were provided for others. In Hudson's audio-recorded interviews with Watauga County singers, he can be heard asking for child ballads by both name and plot descriptors, suggesting that he was also interested in making connections between Appalachian, Scottish, and English traditions. It appears that editors for the Brown collection rejected just one song from the Beech Mountain community, making me suspect that either the collection doesn't contain much from the area in general, or that the editors especially liked those materials. But some of this answer can be found through time spent in the published Brown collection. I'd like now to shift our focus to the singers and songs found in the Sutton Papers, Buchanan Papers, and Hudson collection. Though Sutton collected only 4 Beech Mountain community songs, and I'll add 5 because one of them I found actually in the Patterson Papers instead of the Sutton Papers. Those that she collected were almost exclusively old ballads, and this can be attributed to either Sutton's excitement that these singers knew so many of the ballads and her emphasis on collecting them, the relatively low number of people coming in and out of Beech Mountain when compared with other parts of Avery County, such as towns, logging camps, and iron ore mines, and thus, presumably at this time in the 1910s, maybe less exposure to commercial music, or more likely, some of all of this. The Beech Mountain singers from whom Sutton collected were identified as Mrs. Farthing in Beech Creek and Mrs. Brown on Flat Springs Road. Mrs. Farthing, about whom I know very little, sang Lord Lovell and Catherine Jeffreys for Buchanan. Mrs. Brown sang Sweet Willie, The Brown Girl, and Lord Bateman. All 5 ballads contain references to Scottish or English places, architecture, and social structures such as castles, lords, and ladies. Patterson's article reveals that in Sutton's fieldwork, ballad singers also lacked interest in these references that fascinated Sutton and other collectors. Mrs. Brown was apparently distrustful of Sutton. She, quote, suffered from an educated daughter-in-law who depreciates mountain culture, end quote, and seems to have suspected untoward motives from visitors, and yet she welcomed Sutton into her own home as an overnight guest anyway. She once looked at Sutton's hands and exclaimed, "Ain't you never done a lick of work?" I assumed then that rather than standing still, Mrs. Brown must have been singing while she put up her herbs and dried apples and pumpkin seeds, smoked her pipe, and schemed to keep her grandson from being conscripted into the Great War, all other things that Sutton observed about Mrs. Brown. As far as I've thus far determined, audio recordings were never made of Mrs. Farthing or Miss Brown. The text and melody for the following excerpt of The Brown Girl was collected from Mrs. Brown by Sutton, and it was reprinted by Anne Ingram and is now in the Patterson collection. And though we're unlikely ever to hear Mrs. Brown's singing voice, musical transcription allows us to bring to life one of the, quote, ancient melodies that absolutely enchanted Sutton. So here's just a brief bit of what this might have sounded like. Oh, father and mother, come tell this riddle to me. The brown girl, she has house and lands, fair Ellender, she has none. And I'll just throw my advice to you, go bring the brown girl home. Some of the songs least appreciated by a young Sutton and Buchanan, however, were local favorites, such as Groundhog and Sourwood Mountain, which is the song I mentioned previously that Sutton said you have to be drunk off White Lightning to be able to sing. The Buchanan papers contain several 1936 songs transcriptions from Beech Creek singers Miss Emmy Harmon, who I believe to be my neighbor Margie, Mr. H.A. Hageman, Mrs. Callie Ward, and R.M. Ward. 2 of Harmon's songs, Gypso Davy and The Old Grey Mare, drew Buchanan with their references to Britain and to English pounds. Unfortunately, Buchanan provided a lot less narrative context for these singers than did Sutton. But having now spent a few years studying Appalachian singing traditions and interest in Anglo-American ballads during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, I've come to believe that the desire to connect Appalachian to English traditions shaped preferences for not only the repertoire, but the performance styles and vocal techniques of singers. The clearest example I've come across is seen in Watauga County's I.G. Greer. The Hudson collection contains an interview with Isaac Garfield, I.G. Greer, who was born in 1878, passed in 1966. He was born and raised in western Watauga County's Zineville community before learning of scholarly interest in his family's ballads and folk songs as a UNC student. Greer remembers for Hudson that English professor C. Alfonso Smith charged him in 1906, quote, Greer, go back to the hills and collect every ballad and folk song you can find and preserve them for future generations. End quote. Greer's career took him to Thomasville, where he oversaw the operations of a children's home, and back home to Watauga County to teach history at Appalachian State Teachers College. Through all these years, however, he continued to perform and document ballads in Western and Central North Carolina. And in this interview, Hudson calls him, quote, one of the best folk singers in North Carolina. From the time Greer learned of mountain ballads' appeal to scholars, they were presented to him as an English inheritance. And Greer's interviews with Hudson, as well as records of him elsewhere, confirm his abiding interest in mountain ballads as an inheritance from English ancestors. The printed script of Greer's address to the Friends of the Library at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in 1966 reveals much more about Greer's relationship with English aesthetics. He was involved with the Cecil Sharp House in London, where he performed and was praised by Oxford scholars for, quote, preserving the English ballad truer to its original form, end quote, than the English themselves. Rather than engaging in the popular local fretless banjo tradition, Greer was accompanied by his wife on the mountain dulcimer, an instrument associated with late 19th and early 20th century settlement schools and with what figures such as Wisnet might identify as socially engineered by outside influencers, including folklorists. From all appearances, it seems he strove to perform in a manner that would befit a traditional singer in England. In a speech just a year before his death, in his address to the Friends of University of North Carolina Library, Greer said, quote, may I say this? The real ballad singer doesn't have a trained voice. He doesn't sing for entertainment. He's absorbed in the story, end quote. The same day, Greer recalled that the Oxford professors with whom he spoke after a program at the Cecil Sharp House told him to continue singing ballads unaccompanied, keep the story at the forefront of each performance, and avoid, quote, jazzing them up. With these performance conventions in mind, I'd like us to listen to a recording made by Hudson of Greer singing The House Carpenter on February 3rd, 1962 for Hudson. Notice that Greer's singing uses minimal ornamentation, meaning that most of the time there will only be a note or two on a single syllable, and he incorporates a regular, relatively inflexible rhythm.
Well met, he cried, for I'm just returning from the salt sea, and it's all for the love of thee. Oh, I could have married a king's daughter dear, and she would have married me. But I refused the crown of gold, and it's all for the love of thee.
In listening to Greer, I can't help but think of another recording of The House Carpenter made of a fellow Western Watauga County singer born just 2 years before Greer, Lee Monroe Presnell of the Beech Mountain community. The following recording was not accessed in the Wilson Library Special Collections this summer, but was instead digitized from the 1956 field tapes of Diane Hamilton, Paul Clayton, and Liam Clancy in Beech Mountain. I'm struck by the difference in the vocal technique employed by Presnell versus that we just heard from Greer. As we listen, you'll notice Presnell's much heavier use of ornamentation, many notes on a single syllable, his rhythmic flexibility, and his feathering at the end of some phrases, indicating an abrupt disruption in the flow of breath and resulting in an off-the-voice sort of flip at the end of the phrase.
Well met, my old true love. Well met, she replied to me. I'm just returning from the salt sea. It's all for the love of thee. I could have married the queen's daughter. She would have married me. But I forsake on the silver and her gold. It's all for the love of thee.
There are many reasons Presnell and Greer may have employed different vocal techniques. Presnell was a longtime primitive Baptist preacher and seems to have been influenced in his secular singing by the ornamented, spirit-led singing of his worship community. In middle age, he also lived for 12 to 15 years in Van Buren, Arkansas, where he interacted with another community of singers. It's my hypothesis, however, that Greer believed ballads should be sung as English tradition prescribes, while Presnell, a lifelong farmer whose education was more worldly than formal, had either less awareness of the English connection, no inclination to draw from it, or both. This case study fits with one of the aspects of my research that I'm most excited about, and that's the enculturated nature of the singing voice, vocal technique, and their ability to reveal the social, cultural, and political context of singers. I'll look forward to developing this case study further as I embark on the dissertation writing process. Primarily, my next step for research, because we are back to the further research portion of this presentation. My next step is ethnographic. I've begun talking to living Beech Mountain singers and their families about song, ancestry, and local identity, and I'm finding in these very early stages that while some of their ideas of musical tradition, place, and community have been impacted by early folklorists' interest in English and Scottish materials, those with whom I've spoken have nuanced understandings of their family's ethnic origins, acknowledging Cherokee and occasionally Melungeon ancestry as well as Scottish, Irish, English, and German. I look forward to gathering many more oral histories and analyzing performance conventions, especially vocal technique, of living singers. I'll also continue, however, my conversation with the archive in a quest to better understand ethnic influences on local music and ideas residents have held about them. I've analyzed vocal recordings of Western Watauga County musician Frank Prophet for under-acknowledged influences from the African American blues tradition, while continuing to seek more knowledge of his interactions with musicians in a once sizable but now little-known Black community near Beech Mountain. And in quest of that portion of the research, there are supplementary materials in the W.L. Urey collection at App State, the Rubenstein at Duke, the Library of Congress, and the Archives of Appalachia at East Tennessee State that I hope to access by the end of the year in furthering this research. Again, I'd like to conclude by expressing my sincere thanks to the Wilson Library and all of the staff there for their support of this project. Thank you also to my committee at Indiana University, my chair, Ray Cashman, my committee members, Barbara Hillers and Jason Jackson, Tyron Cooper, and also thanks to Brandon Barker for his help in some of the early stages of this project. So again, my sincere thanks, and I look forward to growing and improving this work with the help of your thoughts and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olivia. I guess before we get into questions, I just want to say that was really beautiful. So questions, people. We have about 10 minutes to talk with people with things that you want to know. You can ask yourself or put it in the chat. I'm happy to read it. The one question I had immediately, Olivia, it was interesting. When you looked at the collections of Sutton and Buchanan, did you notice much of a personal interest in their own genealogies and efforts to sort of trace their family histories to reassure themselves of their origins?
That's a really good question. I would say that in what I saw, I didn't see that directly.
Mhm.
That tends to be a larger part of the interest that many outside influencers in Southern Appalachia in the late 19th and early 20th century had, as they considered, why it was important to them to sort of validate this lineage. Appalachia almost became this repository of the oldest stuff in the United States, it was viewed as. And so if we want to prove that we have this usually English heritage here as white Americans, then let's go to Appalachia and try to make those connections there. But to answer your question specifically, that's not something that I have so far seen in the papers of Buchanan and Sutton. But as I mentioned, I'm excited to come back and get into those other Sutton papers that I did not know about when I was there before.
Oh, yeah, that'll be fun. Thank you. Kaitlyn, I did find myself wondering a little bit about when you were talking about the data that you were analyzing, and you were talking about the ceramic reports that you were finding that were scattered and well hidden. How do you balance using those as a source of information with the artifact themselves? Or am I just imagining something that isn't really a problem?
That's a great question. There is a little bit of it's a great question. For me, I have spent some time with Khashoggi's artifacts specifically. So those have been the key physical artifacts I'm looking at. In a previous iteration of this project, it was sort of my dream to go to the places where these collections are housed and spend time with the artifacts themselves from all of these sites if possible. They are, just as much as the published data is scattered, they are very scattered, and some of them are not currently available given the closing of a lot of collections due to NAGPRA, even though the Maya region isn't subject to NAGPRA. Or they are stored in the governments of the countries where the sites are located, and there's a lot of boundaries to getting there. So the goal with sort of finding a balance is to take this data that I found and make sure that I'm contextualizing it well within all of the information that I can find about these sites from where I'm at. And if needed, and if the funding is available, hopefully finding my way to some of these collections.
Yeah, there's always this degree of practicality that has to drive some of what we do. There are a couple of questions that I wanted to make sure to read. Kaitlyn, this is from you, from Patricia McNeil. Kaitlyn, thank you for your wonderful presentation. What are some of the overarching questions you are asking about shared communities of practice, and what does it mean when two communities are closely or only loosely linked?
Thanks, Trisha. I can hear myself from Trisha's office in the other room, so it's a little but yeah, I am looking into these communities of shared practice. I'm asking questions about what does a similarity in ceramics mean for the transmission of information, and that can sort of, I've approached it in both a direct and indirect manner. There is proximity of a site gives rise to the belief that they're more likely to have been directly interacting with each other, but thinking about it's sort of like a game of ceramic telephone where ideas are being shared with those around you, and then those around you are taking it, making it their own, sharing it. And these ideas can be both based on the technologies and methods used to make the ceramics and stylistic choices. So what do these look like? How do they change over time? A good example of this is in my master's thesis when discussing the transition from the late classic into the post-classic periods. In the late classic, the southern Maya lowlands, so Guatemala, the Petén region, a lot of those big sites are located there, and they have they sort of were the key places with a lot of connections. And after this restructuring and disruption, they pretty much all of those sites depopulate. And so it's the common belief they stopped, like the Maya disappeared, but they restructured and reorganized. And you can see, and I wish I had them up in front of me, the just complete drop off of the south and then a shift into the north, and sites like Mayapan sort of become those key centers, and the ceramic change pretty drastically stylistically between those two time periods, reflecting a more southern presence in the late classic, and then in the post classic a more northern style. So those sites are all really far away from each other, like spanning across countries, which those borders didn't exist back then. But so those ideas are somehow making their way down, whether it be pilgrimages and traveling or just a slow transmission of information from place to place. So it's possible for a site at the very tip of the Yucatan to have the same ceramic type as a site in Belize. And so how did that information get there? What did it change? Like what changed over time, and how did these periods of disruption and transition affect that? Are sort of what I'm looking into. I feel like I've started rambling.
Thank you. We have a question for you, Olivia, from Ray Cashman. First, he says it was nice presentations to both of you. And then Olivia, more directly, I appreciate that it can be difficult to draw a conclusion from a lack of attention to something in archival materials. But did you find evidence of African-American influence being actively disregarded in the papers that you consulted? There's also a smaller question after that.
Okay. For that first question, one of the places that I was really able to see selectivity in the process of kind of what gets labeled as what was in the Arthur Palmer Hudson papers in the discards folder. So to be honest, though, I went through his papers and I had a hard time understanding his system because there were times when he excluded things and said, this is too sentimental. This is sometimes it'd be listed as a minstrel song. There were other times where the note was just, I'm inclined to discard. and so, yeah, and that's something that I am still going through for sure in the context of that particular collection, especially. And some of it too, for instance, with figures like Sutton, there were times when what she collected, she explained, what she thought to be sort of unartistic or of lower cultural value. But usually she didn't go into detail about what that was. She just explained that she didn't like it. And then she presented what she did find to be artful. So you bring up a really good point about how it's kind of hard sometimes to tell based on what's not there. That's definitely something I'm going to continue to dig around in.
The other question that Ray asks is, what do you suppose were the local political orientations that Sutton fervently disagreed with?
Yeah, so Sutton identified herself as a very staunch Democrat. Um, to be honest, the time period, particularly in the mountains, with it being the 1910s and around the era when kind of the understandings that we have today of, that someone labeling themselves as a Democrat being more liberal and someone labeling themselves as a Republican being more conservative. Those were flipped in the Civil War era and we're starting to change back over. But just from the journals themselves, I wasn't able to figure out what kind of Democrat Sutton would have described herself as, whether she was using, like Old South terms or something that would start to look a little bit more like we know today. That's a good question.
Just a comment, Jason Jackson compliments you both. Both presentations turned out to be relevant, very relevant to him. And thanks and well done to both of you. The last question that we have is from Sammy Zila, and it's for Kaitlyn. Your ability to apply modern sentiment to a society we have never known is so beautiful. Do the pottery pieces found indicate any known sentimental or emotional value of the Maya people? Without a written language to corroborate what is found, how is that determined?
Thank you for that great question, Sammy. I will point out, like, the Maya do have a written language, but I feel like what you're saying here is that there's not always language associated with these particular artifacts. I'm of the belief that the pottery does have a sentimental value and an emotional value to people. Thinking about, and this is not just like the really fancy stuff that could be equated to modern day, like fine china that you save and set aside. And it's all based sort of on the context that things are found in. So if you have this really nice vessel that's found within a burial that is a grave good and was likely meant to travel with them to the afterlife, so it was something important that they might have needed. I'm partial to the little teeny tiny shards. I love the well-loved pieces that were probably used up until they broke, like that somebody had a cooking pot that they loved so much and they used until the day it completely fell apart. Like that's something that we do now too. So it is possible to derive this value based on context. So thinking about what types of pots they are, so their form and function and the context in which their place we're able to work on inferring the value of them to the people that made them and used them.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your questions. Those are really wonderful. Thank you both for your presentations. We are slightly over time, which is great. It means people were really engaged, and I think this went really well. If you two just have a minute to stick around just for a little bit of a wrap up, I guess I'd welcome the rest of you to come with us next month. On May 14th, we'll have another research forum, and Kendra Green is going to be presenting about her new book, The Bestiary's Descendants, and Edward Yang is going to be talking about Creating Enchantment, a history of the Gothic in interactive reading experiences. So I look forward to seeing some of you next month. Thank you. Oh, and Nadia sharing the reservation link for you. Well, great. Well, thank you both.